You wrote an op-ed in TechCrunch in which you wrote, populists of both left and right have risen in prominence, and in their search for scapegoats to sustain their success, tech is now firmly in their firing line. What are your biggest concerns when it comes to populism and technology?
My concern is that politicians exploit people's anxiety about the pace of change and the accelerating pace of change. They see these big companies, these wealthy people who run them, and they target the companies and they target the technology as something that's going to disrupt and change our lives in ways that we can't control, and it's basically a bad thing. And my view is that this technological revolution is a fact, but in any event, it's essentially a good thing, but we have to deal with its consequences. But if it's handled in the right way, it can change our lives in good ways, and it can offer enormous opportunities, and it's up to politics to address how we access those opportunities and mitigate the risks, because it will also, for example, displace jobs.
You also say that the first politicians who master the tech revolution will decide what the future looks like. How so?
Because I think if I'm right in saying this technological revolution is the 21st century equivalent of the 19th century industrial revolution, if I'm right in saying that, then look back on what the 19th century industrial revolution did. It changed the way people lived and worked. It changed the relationship between the countryside and the city. In the end, it changed the laws. It changed politics. It changed everything. And this will be the same. So the first politicians that come along and understand it, master it, make sense of it, and show how this can form a narrative of the future that is essentially optimistic, those are the ones that will succeed politically.
So Democratic presidential candidate, U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren has just proposed breaking up the biggest tech companies, Google, Facebook, Apple, Amazon. I assume you don't agree with her proposal, but what do you think?
I don't agree with her proposals, but I think it's a really interesting speech. And, to be fair to her, I think, it's a speech with an intellectual coherence to it. And I think what it shows is, I think, where the Democrat platform may well go. And exactly the same issues are going on in the UK and Europe that viz big tech. Personally, I think a better way of dealing with it is to regulate them through actually having a regulator for these large tech companies. Because I think if you try and break them up, I'm not sure that really works. I think if you try and slice them up, you'll find enormous difficulty in doing that. And it's important always to understand that one of the reasons these companies are so large is because they're offering a service people want. So yes, there are huge questions that arise out of their dominance and their power, but I think it's a better way to regulate this in a way that has the public interest put into the mix when we look at these companies in a sort of structured way than think that you're actually, if you cut them in three, you're going to create a competition.
So what does that regulation look like to you? And should the U.S. take the lead of the EU, which has been pretty tough on big tech?
Yeah, but I think it's less about sort of being tough or not tough. It's working out what the right way to do it. And one of the other things we suggested, by the way, is that it would be sensible, particularly given the huge competitive power of China in AI, particularly in time to come, it would be sensible if Europe and America worked together on this.
How so?
Because if you created a more level playing field between Europe and America, you would actually, you would give people the opportunity then to develop technologies of the future. It would allow these companies, not these big companies, and they're big enough already, but other companies to grow. And I think it would be very sensible to have a kind of transatlantic alliance on regulation of tech for the future. But the purpose of it should not be to hit them or be tough on them. The purpose of it should be to represent the public interest. Because obviously there are public interest issues that come with this. And the sensible thing, rather than trying to decide each of these issues by either, as I say, breaking them up, because I'm not even sure that would destroy their monopoly power. If you broke them up, you might just find you have created 3 monopolies, not one.
Do you believe they're a monopoly?
Well, they are powerful. Let's say they're, if you take Facebook, Google, Amazon, they're incredibly powerful. They're likely to become even more powerful in time to come. But I think a better way of doing it is to look at it in terms of, say, how do we have the public interest into this? So I think these companies, where I think Elizabeth Warren is right, is that they are like utilities, right? They're utility platforms. And so, in the same way when, electricity and the water industry and other things were created in the 19th century, and they were created first in the private sector. In time, people said, well, look, these are utilities everyone depends on, so they're going to have to be publicly regulated. In some cases, people even went to publicly owned. But the point is, if they've got that amount of power, there will be a demand from the public that the public interest is taken into account. But I think a better way of doing that is to have regulators that work with those companies rather than break them up.
So Facebook, for example, multiple scandals, compromised the data of millions and millions of people, many apologies. Mark Zuckerberg, the CEO, has now said, we're going to focus on privacy, we're going to focus on private communication. Is that enough?
Well, I understand why he wants to do that, and privacy is obviously an issue, but I think the central question for all of these tech companies is power. It's their power. I mean, they are powerful. If you look at their dominant position in advertising, or if you look at the role Facebook inevitably will play in politics today. Now, what I think is, in a way, absurd is to sort of say to them, you've got to be responsible for everything that's happening. Right? The truth is, it's a joint responsibility. We have a public interest in making sure that they exercise their position responsibly, but we're going to also have to work with them to share that responsibility from the public policy point of view. Because many of these questions, whether it's hate speech or incitement, or, so for example, radicalization or child pornography, whatever it is, these are things that obviously there's a public interest in sorting out, but that public interest is going to require not just those companies to behave responsibly, but government to be alongside the process of that and making sure that it's done in the most effective way.
So how can we trust the companies to understand and live up to their responsibilities? And similarly, how can we trust government to not be mired in this political process, as we see in both the UK and the US, and actually do something?
Right, so this is a challenge, but in the end, the challenge is best addressed, I think, by a concept of public interest regulation, and whether you do that for each individual company, you might, because there are different issues that arise, for example, in relation to Facebook or Amazon, Google. There are quite different questions that arise. But this is the world we're living in. But there's a bigger question, which is then what happens, for example, if you take driverless cars, and so the next generation of cars are likely to be electric and in time driverless. So this is going to change employment, it's going to change transport, it's probably going to change insurance. It's got a massive series of implications. My point is, this technological revolution is basically benign because, let's be clear, if you can move to driverless cars, you'll probably reduce the number of accidents, you'll probably reduce the cost of travel, but it's got huge consequences. So the role of government is to make sure that the technology is enabled in a sensible way, and the risks of it and the consequences that could be damaging are taken account of.
So let's talk about something that's not benign. Cybersecurity experts are saying that Russian internet trolls are evolving their strategy. They're not creating their own propaganda to interfere in the US 2020 elections. They're creating fake accounts that promote divisive propaganda to essentially mask their identities. I mean, does that concern you?
Yeah, of course. And what we've got to do is we've got to get a real handle on it, expose it and sort it out. Now, at this point in time, I think there's a big question for Western policymakers, which is, what's your sanction? Mm-hmm. At a certain point, are you going to retaliate? Is it possible to get some form of agreement where countries come together and agree that these things can't happen? I think these are really difficult questions, and I'm not actually sure what the answer at the moment is, but I think for sure it's going to become a major question, because you're going to get, and by the way, what Russia is doing could easily be followed by other countries, and it's a completely new form of warfare, and a very serious one.
How concerned are you about the rise of China in technology?
Very, but on the other hand, if I was Chinese, I'd say, why shouldn't we be great in technology? We're going to be one of the most powerful countries in the world, and our economy is going to be one of the largest, not the largest. We're going to be a big political power, so why shouldn't we also be a big tech power? And I would say, okay, I completely understand that, but I think the competition coming out of China, because it is a different political system to ours, means it's all the more important that we as policymakers respond to this tech revolution in the right way, not the wrong way.
Is the rise of the Chinese tech industry, in your view, an existential threat to Western liberal democracies? I
mean, that's a very big statement to make. I think it poses challenges for it. Let me put it in that way for the moment. And certainly part of the policy debate that we've got to have is that how do we manage to maintain a technological edge?
So you're in Silicon Valley, you're meeting with companies. Who are you interested in working with, and what do you want to accomplish?
Well, I'm interested in working with the companies large and small. And what we're doing is creating within my institute a center for tech and public policy. And the idea is to put change makers and policymakers together in circumstances where we can bring a mutual understanding, and out of that should come what I call realizable and sensible policy.